They've had enough of this. People literally posting pictures of the SS or speeches of Hitler translated into English to try to make him look good. And so this is why I wanted to come to Israel. MAGA, the conservative movement in the United States, could not be taken from the outside, so they have to take it from the inside. They've been lied to so much that all you have to do is tell them that the other things you also believe were also lies. You know, there's a war like right there, and everybody's just going about life. Oh, I have to pick up my M4 and go to the border? Okay, let's go.
What you presented, this is a right-wing phenomenon, and the right is destroying the right. Ladies and gentlemen, גבירותיי ורבותיי, גם בעברית. Welcome to a live episode of Gatekeeper of shomersaf, co-sponsored by Sela Meir, not for the first time, partners of this podcast, and we are happy. We will show you the crowd too, because there's a huge crowd here. We had to take extra chairs. All these people came to listen to James Lindsay, מחבר הספר, the author of Cynical Theories, which appeared in Hebrew at Sela Meir. So without further ado, I want to invite to the stage James Lindsay, please.
Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you, Amiad and Herut, for having me. Thank you, Sela Meir, for putting this together and for publishing my book in Hebrew. I think it's in 30-something languages now. This I hadn't seen, and I'm very appreciative of this because I got to learn how much more difficult it is to sign a book that opens the wrong way. I mean, maybe ours open the wrong way since your language is like 3 million years older than ours. I don't know. But at any rate, thank you so much for having me. I'm very, very proud to be here. Something I've been asked all week that I didn't expect to be asked is, why have you come to Israel? Like it's some kind of a surprise that somebody would want to come here. And the answer is to see. And this is what I wanted to kind of just open before we have our conversation. I wanted to see for myself what I've put a stake in. So I'll tell you a little bit of a story about my journey, but obviously since October 7th, things have been ugly, very ugly. In the U.S., obviously you know what's gone on here better than I do. I've seen a little of it, but certainly in the U.S., things have been very ugly. The left reacted exactly as one would predict, as we know that they've taken up with so-called Palestine. That is something that they train their radicalism there. They claim that they have been radicalized once by the critical theories in the United States universities, and often again when they come to Palestine or when they see Palestine. They acted exactly as I predicted they would. On October 7th, we all know what happened. And on October 8th, I said, this will be Gaza Floyd, referring to George Floyd. And that what Israel would respond as it should and as it did, and immediately the propaganda would come out, and it would be, you know, poor us for starting a war. Oh no, we're the victims now that we're getting absolutely trounced. And I was right. This is what the left did. They started these totally predictable protests that are funded by communists all across the U.S. This isn't a surprise. A lot of their theory is rooted in communism and socialism, as I've been explaining for several years. The idea of a post-colonial theory was developed by a violent radical named Frantz Fanon, who believed that the colonized people regain their dignity by doing murder against their colonizers, almost like a kind of ritual. This kind of theory was picked up and postmodernized by a Palestinian-American theorist named Edward Said, who wrote a book about Orientalism. And of course, the left has characterized you as the settler colonialists who must be destroyed because you represent Western values being imposed into what was supposed to be apparently not a Western part of the world. So this is their logic, and they're very angry. I had discovered in 2020 also that critical race theory, which we talked about in Cynical Theories, touches on this issue. This is much more relevant in America than here. There's a book published in the 1990s that explains, it's called How Jews Became White Folks and What That Means About Race in America by a woman named Karen Brodkin. And she explains, see if this sounds like a familiar story. My friends, my Jewish friends, let's see if this is familiar. Apparently Jews decided that they needed to no longer be considered a minority, so they worked very hard to get recognized as white, to establish themselves as a privileged group, and then they threw other racial minorities, under, like black people in the US and so on, under the bus in order to raise their own status, and then they became white. And when they became white, being rich and powerful and whatever else, they then became the cultural leaders of whiteness. They took over Hollywood, they took over the media, they took over TV, they took over all these culture-producing institutions and became the setters of whiteness. The people who lead what whiteness is for all other white people became Jews, and obviously, therefore, they have all this privilege, and yet they hide behind this shield of oppression, historical oppression, whether, as we saw at the City of David back to 70, 80, and before, or whether, as we saw at Yad Vashem in 1945 and before, or whether every day, frankly every day, for 3,500 years or something. So you're now a privileged group pretending to be an oppressed group so that you can't be criticized, but you're still a privileged group. And I thought, this is a problem. I wrote an article about this called Critical Race Theory's Jewish Problem in 2020. I started to tweet that critical race theory, I said this I don't know how many times, critical race theory is the biggest threat to American Jews today. I tweeted that probably 1,000 times. Critical race theory is the biggest threat to American Jews today, and I knew it was for two reasons. One was because that it creates this narrative on the left in a way that's resonant with Western audiences who might not care as much about the settler colonialist project, that they would understand this through the lens of America's history of racism in some very peculiar way and racial privilege, and that this would work out poorly for American Jews. And then secondly, because it would create a backlash. So in 2021, I had a very uncomfortable experience. I got invited to a very, very nice, very, it wasn't quite black tie, but a very fancy conference, a very expensive conference as a speaker. And I went to this in January 21, and I was surrounded by other right-wingers. This was at the Claremont Institute, had hosted this conference. And at lunch one day, I was sitting around the table with, it was during COVID, so there were 4 of us at a giant table, in case, breathing would hurt one another. And so we were talking, and there was this young man sitting directly opposite from me. I don't know his name. I can't call him out. I think everybody here knows I would, happily, if I knew his name, but I either didn't get it or forgot it or didn't care or something. But he started saying a lot of very wild things about how America was destined for a civil war, that there'd be no way out of this problem of the woke left without having this kind of fight. And he got more and more and more intense about the need to rally around shared values, which started to get awfully fascistic in the way he was phrasing things. And everybody at the table was getting very uncomfortable. And I finally decided to cut across this young man who was still talking about his video games and this. I'm not joking. And I said, "You're beginning to sound a lot like Hitler." To which he replied, "At least Hitler knew how to stop communists." Which I thought, that's the wrong answer. Actually, I said, that's the wrong answer. But I went away from this table. He said more, I'll tell you. Then I'll tell you what I did. He said more. He went on to say more of these kinds of fascistic things and defend the Nazis and their fight against the communists and so on and so forth. And then he comes to the point where he's talking about how useful my work has been to the American right wing, not conservative, right wing movement. And so it will continue to be useful for a while, exposing communists, explaining critical theory. And then he says, but eventually, you're not one of us. So we'll be forced to force convert you or kill you. Now this guy's about yay big. So I said to him, will you be doing this yourself? because I'll be happy to neutralize the problem right now if that's the case. And he said, no, we'll send people, because of course he's a coward. I asked him what he would do in the Civil War that he was predicting. He said he would make memes to make the fighting more vigorous. Not a lot of courage behind these things. But that's when I knew the right wing in America had a problem. January of 2021. They were at the conference, not on the stage, but in the hallways and in the rooms, talking at the bar, talking about what we now call noticing. Did you notice that Karl Marx was Jewish? Did you notice that all of the critical theorists in the Frankfurt School were Jewish? Did you notice that progressive Jews fund a lot of this woke nonsense? Have you noticed this? We call this a hasty generalization in logic, where you notice some examples of a thing and then extend it to the entire population. So there are some people who have Jewish heritage, I don't think they're very religiously Jewish, who decide to do bad things, therefore all Jews are bad. That's called a hasty generalization, but this is happening. They asked me, James, what religion were all of the Frankfurt School critical theorists? And I said, communist, and they were very upset, because apparently they wanted me to say they were all Jewish. But I don't think that Herbert Marcuse, for an example, was terribly religiously Jewish or even recognized that at all. But I knew that we had a problem. I called my business partner on the phone that afternoon. I said the right will be a bigger problem than the left within a year or two. And we have to keep an eye on this. So I kept an eye on it, and I talked about it here and there. And frankly, Biden was in the White House. We had some problems happening in the United States. The transition problem, the transgender problem, was rapidly on the rise. As I had predicted in my first speech about critical race theory, they said, James, come tell us what critical race theory is. No one in the world knows. And I said, I got asked to come talk about critical race theory, and I hate to tell you, it's 5% of our problem. It's the lock pick, and it has picked the lock to the gates of civilization, and what's about to come through it is much worse. But I'll tell you about it since you don't even know what it is yet. And so I talked about critical race theory, but queer theory was coming through. Post-colonial theory was coming through. Everything we've seen on both the American left and right since October 7th was coming through, and because I had written this book in 2019, I knew what else was coming, and that critical race theory was actually the least of our problems. People didn't want to hear that the right had problems through this entire time. I'd bring it up, it wouldn't get much attention, I would get a phone call, why don't you shut up, people don't care about this, Biden's in the White House, these people have no power, it's not going to be an issue, leave it alone, don't draw attention to it, you're helping them recruit, whatever it was, whatever excuse not to draw attention to this. We all need to be working in unity on the right, not fighting with one another. And so I couldn't stay silent, but I criticized a little and a little more and a little more. And then October 7th comes along in 2023, and I criticize a lot more. By sometime in the middle of October or November, I don't remember when exactly, I finally made my decision. I'm with Israel. I'm standing with Israel on this. I'm not going to waver or waffle or hide behind the fact that there's an ocean and most of a continent between us. This is right versus wrong. This is good versus evil. This is true versus false. I know which side I'm on. So I took this stand. It wasn't a popular stand, but it wasn't the end of my career or anything like this. The right was growing, as you all have seen, more and more and more anti-Semitic, though, 1 month after the next, from the end of 2023 through all of 2024, and this is when it started to get very heated. Through the middle of 2024, I started to notice, the noticing thing, that there were a lot of people calling themselves noticers online, that there was a lot of people saying that the Jews or Israel, or sometimes both, were behind virtually every historical evil. And I had to take another stand, this time at home. In particular, I had to take a stand against my friends, some of whom were getting pulled into this. I had to say this is the wrong way. I had to stand up for what's right, for what's true. And we had this election coming. There was an election of very high stakes, Donald Trump versus whatever her name was. And we can't lose this election. and I think you guys appreciate how important that election was as well. We can't lose this election, so I kept telling myself, you have to speak up but keep your powder dry. You have to speak up but keep your powder dry. I'd post on social media, I'd get 1,000 replies, and half of them would be Nazi propaganda. Outright Nazi propaganda, not something that the left would call Nazi propaganda. In fact, the left didn't notice any of this. You know, they could find racism and Nazis in Iraq for the last 10 years, but they couldn't notice people literally posting pictures of the SS or speeches of Hitler translated into English to try to make him look good. They didn't see any of that. But I did. I saw it hundreds or thousands of times a day. And finally I said, we've got to say something. It doesn't matter that there's an election coming, because they're going to try to make a move. And this is what's actually happening in the United States. This is what it's actually about. It's about the fact that MAGA, the conservative movement in the United States, could not be taken from the outside, so they have to take it from the inside. They have to fracture it. And so Israel, I noticed how it's shaped on the map, is a wedge. Think of your map. A wedge. Okay, thank you for getting my joke. And they're driving that wedge harder and harder and harder into the American conservative movement because they can. They can show all of the Palestinian or Iranian or Qatar or Russia or China propaganda. They can show all of it. They can say, look at these kids. This is a genocide. This is a whatever. Occupied Palestine, something, something. And they can work up the same sympathies, the same poisoned empathy that the left has fallen for, though for different reasons. And they can break the American conservative movement. They can take this coalition that came out for Trump, many never having voted for a Republican in their lives, and scatter them to the wind to make sure that this never happens again. And they can create challenges for Trump and his administration that he'll have 10 times more work to do anything that he wants to do, because his base is split, scattered, and fighting with each other over this crucial issue, which can be framed as just a foreign affairs issue, as though it's not literally the battle for Western civilization with you standing bravely on the front line for the rest of the world. And they've been very successful at doing this. So at the end of the year, this is what I really want to tell you. At the end of the year, in 2024, I decided, it was September, so about 1 year ago, I decided to take this stand. And I decided to start calling these people, for right or for wrong, in wisdom or foolishness, I started to call these people the woke right, because they act just as woke as their counterparts. I can add the depth of the postmodernism or the critical theory or the Marxist theory or whatever, if we want, but they're just as woke as their counterparts on the left, and they share many of the same goals. And in one movement, something I did not expect happened. In one movement, the radical right and then the whole conservative movement turned on its heel away from me. And I went from having a productive and important career informing conservatives throughout the United States about the dangers of Marxism, the relationship to fascism, and all of these things, all of the woke ideology, all the pieces, to having no career, pretty much overnight. About 90% of my career evaporated pretty much in an instant. And I didn't stop. They were mad, so woke right is a term they don't like, so it must be a good term. Maybe it's not, but I kept using it. I kept hammering this, woke right, woke right, woke right. Then in December, I sent them an article. I sent into a Christian nationalist publication called American Reformer, 6 pages of the Communist Manifesto, not Jewish. I sent them 6 pages of the Communist Manifesto dressed up as Christian nationalist rhetoric about the new Christian right, and they published it. Kind of like the old hoax papers, which they all liked until it happened to them, at which point they didn't like me anymore, or think it was funny, or anything. But what happened shocked me beyond the shock that I already had. What happened was that they stood by this publication. They said, this is a reasonable aggregation of how we think. It's like, it's the Communist Manifesto. You're supposed to be on the right wing. They defended Karl Marx. They said he was a great writer. They said he had great ideas, a great criticism of liberalism and capitalism. They defended the critical theorists. They said we're postmodern traditionalists, which means they're not traditional. They're pretending to be traditional. They came out of the woodwork to defend these things, and then they doxed me, which means to put out all of my family's private information on the internet. I had some pizzas delivered to my house that I never ordered, that kind of thing. Luckily, the police never showed up to my house yet to intimidate us. They put out my family's information. They found members of my family and started harassing them. They harassed me constantly for months. And maybe a handful, 5, 6, 10 maybe, prominent, 2 maybe prominent, 5 or 10 total American conservatives took a stand beside me. Most of them found ways to turn against me. And I thought, well, what am I going to do? And believe it or not, it's a friend of mine who's Jewish calls me in the midst of this, and he says, in our religion, we believe this. We believe when a man renders a service to God, that Satan attacks, and Satan's affairs are in the world, so he ruins you in the world, your money, your relationships, your opportunities, that kind of thing. And God watches to see if you keep your faith. And I thought, well, that's a lot to live up to. Okay. Send me. And I did. And I stood. And so this is why I wanted to come to Israel. I've been put through a very long year. A lot of it has to do with your country, except it's not about your country. Your country's a wedge. It's about my country. And the attempt to destroy my country using the only tool that they have left, which is your country. And I wanted to see. I wanted to see for myself, and I had the opportunity, thanks to Lחירות, to come see what Israel's about for myself. And of course, what I see is that the propaganda is ridiculous. In fact, I knew it was ridiculous, but I didn't know how ridiculous it was till I got here. It's so upside down, it's so backwards. This country is everything that American conservatives wish America was. It's religious, it's family-oriented. It's fun, it's free. You can tell the difference in Jerusalem versus Tel Aviv, I noticed. Little difference. You have a lot of everything, and you're also brave. You stand on the front lines of civilization against barbarism, and you show up to do it. I heard story after story about people after October 7th who showed up. They said, put me back in the army. I'm in reserve. Let's go. People flying home from the United States to join the army, to go fight, because this is what needs to be done for Israel, this courage. And they're just everybody. They're just everybody. They're bus drivers. They're normal people who all come together to fight for civilization, not just for their country, not just for their families, but yes, those, but for civilization itself against the greatest enemies of civilization, of Israel and of the United States, eagerly, generously, and with a courage. I feel like it's hard not to feel like a coward when you meet Israelis and they see how just normal it is to be brave.
You haven't met our intellectuals, James.
I'll take that. And so what did I see? I'll just tell you. We visited Yad Vashem, and we walked out. You know, you walk through this long zigzag of horror, and then you finally come out, and what do you see? You see this open vista. We got out at night. We almost got locked in. It would have been a long night. We came out. It was dark. The lights were on at the city. And you see this, not particular, it's not like you see, you know, the Temple Mount or so. You just see this everyday life part of Jerusalem. And there it is. People living their lives, driving their cars, blowing their horns. As it were, some trees, some nice things. And what do you see? What you see is Am Yisrael Chai. That's what you see. And this trip has therefore been a renewal of my faith and my courage, my resolve, my willingness to fight for my country and yours, to take this fight back to these idiots that are falling for the worst propaganda from the worst enemies of civilization and using it against us both. And my gratitude is to you. So thank you, and I'll have this conversation with our friend Gadi now.
Thank you very much, James, for these inspiring words and worrying diagnosis. So the first question, listening to you, that comes to mind is, how all-engulfing is this? Because it seems to be a long time coming tsunami on the left, and now this sudden rise on the right. And my partner in the Israel Update podcast says, this is not the everyday Americans who actually are in Israel's favor. So is that an elite phenomenon on both sides, or is this deep with the American public?
Unfortunately, the answer is complicated. The short answer is that it's not representative of the American conservative public. And certainly the people who recognize themselves as conservative versus right-wing, and they make this distinction clearly, the conservatives, this is not, this woke right thing or new right or dissident right phenomenon is not particularly common. But that's the short answer. It's much more complicated than this. I'll start by saying I don't think it's organic. It becomes organic. You need to understand how propaganda works. Is you start with something very inorganic from the top down to inspire a bottom up that becomes a kind of self-fulfilling monster. It grows organically after it's been infected. And this, I think, has gone pretty far. But what you have to understand is almost perfectly you can draw a line. That line is drawn somewhere between 30 and 35 years old. Above that line, older than that line, American conservatives stand with Israel, and they're very confused about what's happening, probably everybody as much as you are. They're disgusted, they're horrified. I hear from them all the time. The most common phrase that I hear when I go in actual public with real people, most of whom are older than 35, is, what the hell is going on? They're terrified. They're disgusted. I see it all the time. On the other hand, under 35, the propaganda, or under 32, 33, somewhere in this range, under that age bracket, the propaganda has been much more effective. The lines have been things like, well, the reason that it's hard for you to buy a home and start a family, which many American conservatives kind of want to do, is because we send $3 to $4 billion a year in aid to Israel. If we had more money that we were keeping at home, if we followed this America First, so-called America Only program, then we would have more money and people would be able to buy houses and start families and do all these things, get out of their student loan debt. So there's a strong agitation that's happening that's affecting young people differently. And it's becoming more characteristic of the American conservative. This is a very specific demographic. American conservative, young, male, who go to a lot of political things and spend too much time online. Within that very specific demographic, this is a wildfire. Outside of this demographic, it's not. And I can give at least one hopeful piece of proof, which is at a recent Turning Point USA event where they're continuing the tour that Charlie Kirk did not finish. Glenn Beck spoke. And so what happened was they had a couple of these young people showed up and they asked Glenn Beck some questions like, don't you think Israel's acting very suspiciously, or whatever the anti-Semitic nonsense. And Glenn Beck apparently answered these questions admirably. And then what happened was they cut the video to make it look like Glenn Beck didn't know how to answer this. They put this out on the internet, them asking the so-called hard question, Glenn Beck failing to answer it adequately. And this was total propaganda. It turns out Glenn gave excellent answers. Glenn is horrified by what he sees. He's fighting now quite firmly, while he's wavered a bit in the past. He's quite clear. And the truth was he gave great answers. So when these young people stood up to punk him, what happened was nobody clapped, 2 or 3 people, awkward room. And then when Glenn gave the excellent answers, the room erupted with support for Israel. And that's mostly young people turning out to Turning Point events. So there is a very persuasive illusion among young conservative men who spend far too much time online that Israel is the cause of all their problems. But otherwise, it's not representative of the conservative movement. And if you would have asked me this question a month ago, I would have been much more dire. But I've watched the fight back against this, which I've been waiting 2 years to see, really take off this month. This month, October, not before October. And so I'm now hopeful. And it's not representative of American conservatism, and I think we're going to fight back, but we have the ugly part right now in front of us.
One more reason to wean ourselves off American aid, which is also trapping us militarily, as we saw under the Biden administration, and also weakening our own spine. It's time we stood up for ourselves in these things. You know, one of the most interesting things you said, there were many, was that they are trying to split MAGA. They're trying to split Donald Trump's base. I've heard this argument before, I think, from Lee Smith at Tablet, who holds views similar to your own on many things, and is one of the best analysts around. And the first question has come to mind, why? Why would Tucker Carlson, who seemed to be an anti-woke warrior, I used to quote Tucker Carlson on the Russian hoax. He was one of my best sources. I was one of the few who wrote about these things here. So why would a man who clearly resented CRT, Obama, the whole worldview of the woke, suddenly want to drive a wedge through the base of the other party?
So whether you realize it or not, you've asked two questions. One of these questions is, why would, I'm going to use a vague word, a pronoun, they. Why would people in general, why would the bad guys want to drive this wedge? And then the other question is ultimately, why is Tucker Carlson as a specific individual a bad guy? So now we have two questions that are happening here, a bad guy in this regard. And the answers to the first one's very easy, but I think it's important to say, I think everybody intuits this. MAGA represents the greatest threat to this global agenda that we've seen, the agenda of China, the agenda of Russia, which is working with them, the agenda of Iran, which is working with them, the agenda, you name it. The axis of bad guys, the axis of evil, all needs America to fall. They all need Trump to fail. And Trump is a tremendous threat to their program. But Trump also cannot solve this problem in 4 years, especially if he's bogged down with an infighting conservative movement underneath him. So he tries to make a decision, and rather than having, you know, half of America behind him, cheering for him, and saying this was a great decision, he now has half of that fighting against him and half of that supporting him, or probably a third actually that don't even know what's going on and are confused. So the enemies of America in general, who are also the enemies of Israel in general, need Trump to fail. So that's the big picture question. And this is how they've chosen to go about splitting his base, confusing the situation so that operational goal can be achieved against the United States and its strategic partnerships with Israel, which go beyond the foreign aid money tremendously. We have many interests in common in the region and around the world, especially against the Belt and Road Initiative and these things coming from China and Russia. Okay, so what about Tucker Carlson? I would love to know. I would love to know. I've thought he was an actor for a very long time. I've not trusted Tucker Carlson for much longer than most people who work with the conservative movement. My wife is basically a savant at who to trust and who not to trust. And the second she saw him for the first time on TV, she said, that man's an actor and he lies. So I just listen to my wife, as any smart married man does.
And she chose you, so...
Yeah, well, she's also brilliant, as you can tell.
Yeah.
Has very poor vision. No, but smart. No, but she's never trusted him. I haven't trusted him in a very long time. I started to wonder why he was able to say so many things on television that no one else was allowed to say. But there might be some interest convergence happening. Everybody is calling him now Tucker Carlson, suspecting that he's taking money from Qatar. I don't know if that's true. The proof has yet to surface. That's a high accusation. But where there's smoke, there may be fire. There's an awful lot of smoke on that. He's done confusing things with the state of Russia. One does not merely sit down to interview Putin. I don't know what's gone on there.
Or the president of Iran.
Or that, yeah. But particularly with Russia, there's something going on there. He has some relationship. I don't know what the nature of that is. But Tucker Carlson has a political philosophy that's not identical to MAGA's. His political philosophy, MAGA is very pro-America in almost a very kind of common sense, folksy way, almost a populist way in some regards, but it's just, we love America, Trump hugging the American flag, you know what it looks like. And Tucker Carlson's political beliefs are an older form of conservatism, sometimes called paleoconservatism, that wants something different. And MAGA is the thing. So you have this, 8 years of Barack Obama. Then all of a sudden, the conservative movement's about to have a renaissance. And it turns out that it maybe could go paleoconservative, but instead it goes MAGA. It goes Trump. He's resentful.
So Tucker Carlson, the individual, is just an example because a lot of these people come from MAGA. Steve Bannon was he was foolish enough to say that he was the brains behind Trump. That's never a good thing for anyone to say that he's the brains behind the chief. It cost him his job. But he certainly comes from these circles. And what is worrying are and what you presented, this is a right-wing phenomenon, and the right is destroying the right.
This is, I don't want to get this philosophical, but this is a left-wing phenomenon dressed as a right-wing movement.
But from people who originate with MAGA.
But yeah, from within, yeah, of course. Like I said, the purpose here is that they could not take MAGA from without, so they have to take MAGA from within. So I would expect that there are plants from our adversaries, both foreign and domestic, within MAGA. If I was a Democrat, I would definitely have had some people who had a sudden change of heart who switched sides, and now they're working, evil from within. If the deep state and wanted to undermine Trump, even if that's only a small portion of the executive apparatus, this is exactly the kind of intelligence operation I would run to undermine Trump and to split this movement.
So these people were not real MAGA, in your opinion? I
think that the people who started to call themselves dark MAGA told on themselves that they're not real MAGA. They're fake MAGA. Yeah. I think that this is not representative of your average American conservative Christian, which is what they claim to speak for, in any regard whatsoever. And the ones that I see in real life don't hold any of these views.
Let's lighten up the mood a bit, because what you did with the grievance studies were, it was, apart from being brilliant and very useful, it was really hilarious. And the grandfather of all this, I had the privilege of interviewing him, is Alan Sokol.
Yes.
One memorable phrase that he said in that interview, I think it was 93.
96.
96?
Yeah, 96.
So just say a word who Alan Sokol is, and then I'll tell this story, because it's...
Alan Sokol is a physicist, now turned mathematician, who in 1995-6, right around the end of the year, beginning of the next, had sent a hoax paper to a postmodern social commentary journal published by Duke University called Social Text or something like that.
Social Text, right?
Yeah, Social Text. And it was something about quantum gravity being a hermeneutic for some kind of racism or sexism or something like this. That gravity basically is a social construct that somehow is probably bad for women or something. And so he writes this paper, and Social Text publishes it, and he comes out with a very detailed explanation the following year. He actually wrote a book in 2 languages, in both English and in French, explaining himself, and became kind of, he kind of shot the arrow in the 1990s that more or less took down the kind of postmodern impostures that were happening within the academic world.
So the memorable phrase that he said was that if people believe that physics are a social construction and that the law of gravity is a social construction, they're welcome to try their theory out of my office window. That was the 21st floor in a building at NYU.
I think that's a microaggression now.
And so, James, the next question I have for you is, why do penises cause global warming?
Because they're raping virgin environments, of course.
I should have known.
So, in the model of Alan Sokol, what happened was my friend Peter Boghossian and I had been watching this these academic papers get published. We'd been getting harassed and harangued by these academics, and at Peter's University, the diversity office was calling him for all manners of things. And so we tried to criticize, and nobody wanted to hear it. And so Peter knew Alan, actually, Alan Sokol, and he called me one day after a paper had come out about needing to make the science of glaciology feminist in order to stop climate change, using feminist art projects in place of, say, satellite photos, which they called pornographic, because, you know, I don't know why. They assume a God's eye view from nowhere that doesn't exist, that's in the paper. And so this feminist glacier paper comes out about ice, and I read this thing, and I go into kind of a stupor. Peter sees the articles. It was on $500,000 almost of National Science Foundation taxpayer money in the United States, and Peter says, if they'll publish this, they'll publish anything. Let's write an academic hoax. So I said, why? I'm going to sound more creative than I really am. I had just read a paper in what's called Gender in Society, which is the leading gender studies magazine or journal, that talked about menstrual blood as a social construct. So I said, why not say penises as a social construct, and say that they cause all the problems in the world. And then Peter says, especially climate change, and I'm like starting to laugh, like sweating, I'm laughing so hard. And so I go to the Wikipedia and I type in penises and anatomical organ of the male, you know, whatever. And I just start copy-pasting this into a document, and I start writing a thing. Peter puts in the most juvenile humor that you can imagine. If you've seen Varsity Blues, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, you're better off not knowing. Very juvenile humor about all this. And then we said, you know, the penises cause all the problems in the world, especially because they make men macho, and especially climate change. And this paper we sent off, and one thing leads to another, and it gets published by a very ambiguous journal, a very bad journal. We called it the conceptual penis is a social construct. If you wonder why I am conceptual James, it's because I replaced the word penis with my name. And my own famous handle is a joke about myself. I called myself a dick, if you wondered what the joke is. So anyway, we send this off. We send it to a real journal, and they forward it to a pay-to-play journal, which publishes it without charging us, because they messed up, because they're, you know, a tight operation there. And we spiked the football and said, you know, gender studies is bogus, we proved it. And so Alan Sokol writes an article saying, not quite, not so much. And he says, you've proved a little bit, but you haven't proved what you should have. If you had used more journals, better journals, more papers, and some other kind of more technical details with the peer review process and journal impact factors and so on, then perhaps you would have proven that there's a structural problem to the way that a field like gender studies is being conducted. And so Peter and I got on the phone and said, well, let's do that. So we dedicated the next year and a half of our lives to what's become known as the Grievance Studies Affair, and we didn't limit ourselves to conceptual penises, but we ran the gamut of academic foolery.
Along with Ellen Pluckrose.
Yeah, it turns out Peter and I didn't know that much about what we were doing. We were funny, I suppose, but we didn't know what we were doing. But Helen, who wrote Cynical Theories with me, Helen knew the postmodern literature because she was required to use it against her will to finish her master's degree. So she had done a master's degree in English literature, looking at the period roughly around Shakespeare, and had written a paper about Othello. And of course, Othello, you have this relationship happening that's cross-racial, but it's also cross-religious. And she made the argument that it wasn't a scandal because of the race difference, but rather because of the religion difference.
Oh, that's
and
terrible.
she was told that she was, you know, the exact line was something, her advisor told her something like, could you imagine how a black American would feel reading this, not respecting his belief that this is racism, and instead saying that race wasn't a major factor in late medieval England? And so she was horrified and knew the literature very well because they forced her to use it. So we recruited Helen about a month and a half into the Grievance Studies Affair. She supported us with the conceptual penis, so I knew she'd be okay. So I called her and I said, Helen, will you help us write a lot more papers? And she reluctantly at first, but then enthusiastically as we went along, agreed. And so the three of us ended up writing 20 papers in the following year.
You've managed to make postmodernism funny, which is not trivial at all.
It just requires holding up a mirror.
Yeah, but first of all, My late mother, who was a latent intellectual, said, what will kill this phenomenon is boredom. It is always, always the same. And when I teach this, and I do, I tell students, when you come out of my class, you will have the magic key to open any postmodern text. And you know they're hard to read because they're laden with all this pompous jargon, but they always say the same. The question is not what is true. The question is who gets to decide.
That's right.
And the answer is also always the same. The hegemonic group in the service of their hegemony. And it's like a meat grinder that take whatever you put in it, you get the same awful sausage all the time. So it's utterly predictable and totally boring. But you guys made it funny because how ridiculous is it that you can take a feminist journal and have them publish a chapter from Mein Kampf, from Hitler, if you change Jews to men. And then everything suddenly makes sense. So that specific example, how did they not realize what you were doing?
I don't think they read things that they, I don't think they'd actually read Mein Kampf. They only read each other, and their pompous things. But it's that the underlying logic is similar, if not the same. The underlying logic is that there is a group of people with racial characteristics in this case, or sexual characteristics maybe. There's a group of people who are holding back the ability for the totality to have justice. That group is overrepresented. They're given privilege and power that they don't deserve. This is a very familiar story for all Jews. And that if we could just either re-educate them or get rid of them, then we would be able to move forward along the arc of history toward justice. The argument is the same. I mean, technically it's a little different because the communists were focused on economics. They said seize the means of production, which means seize the means of economic production, which actually means, because they believe that economic conditions produce man, that you're seizing the means of the production of mankind by seizing his working conditions, where the Nazis said, no. Hitler said, no. The communists got it all wrong. It's not economics that matters. He said that's a Jewish idea. It is, in fact, race that matters. And so if you can seize the means of racial production...
And so Hitler was a critical race theorist of sorts.
He was. It's the same idea. It's exactly the same idea. It's just a different location for how society produces its individuals and grants them privileges or oppresses them.
This is not for this conversation. I'll just mark it with an asterisk. Postmodernism has two streams. Not everything descends from Marx. There's a strand that descends from Nietzsche.
That's right.
And they merge. Where is all this going, do you think?
Well, so I had a decisive moment that changed my life during this grievance studies. I was writing these papers. One of our papers was about education, and we had said basically, well, there's some people that have privilege. We'll find out who they are through these various tests. We'll have them line up and walk up and down football fields according to question and answer. This is called a privilege walk. The privilege walk actually comes from Herbert Marcuse's third wife joined a cult that's a spin-off of Scientology called Reevaluation Counseling, and they were at one of their cult retreats, and she came up with this idea that we could do racial reevaluation by having people find out how privileged they were through this walk. But at any rate, this thing got incorporated in all kinds of universities, so we wrote a paper saying we'll do this, and the more privileged that the kid is, the more we'll abuse him in class, but we'll do it with compassion, because we didn't want these compassionate lefties to, throw away our paper. So we, suggested chaining them to the floor in class and things like this, and with compassion. And what the peer reviewers wrote back was, we love this idea. You have the right idea, but you can't use compassion. Because it threatens to recenter the needs of the privileged students who you're supposed to be inducing into discomfort so that they can reckon with their privilege directly. So use this other model instead called the pedagogy of discomfort, which means a teaching theory of bringing people into discomfort, leaving them there to sit in it until they have a change of heart. In other words, it's kind of a trauma-induced brainwashing program. And I was so horrified, I said that the logic of this ends in genocide. I said this is the seed of a genocide. Got in a lot of trouble for that. And where this ends up probably is not there. now in retrospect, but in 2018, when I saw that, this is why I quit my job and started to study postmodernism and critical theory and Marxism full-time. I asked my wife, can I quit my job and study this full-time, because I think it's going to end civilization, which she thought was crazy, by the way. She thought we were making jokes, and now all of a sudden I'm talking about the end of the world. And she says to me, and I quote, as I think everybody in this room is about to appreciate a lot, can you make money doing that?
Yes.
The answer was unclear, but yes. But this changed my life. So where does this end? This ends actually, here's the big picture story of what's happening in the world in like a minute. The goal is to make China rise and Western civilization decline. So what you do is you set up the entire system of the world to operate the economy like China's, which is called a stakeholder economy. It's not purely communist. The CCP runs the stakeholder system. You've probably heard of stakeholder capitalism. So China's on a stakeholder system. By the way, the first stakeholder system ever implemented by law was implemented in 1937 in Germany under a law called the Nazi Shareholder Act. So communist China is running Nazi economic principles to do what it does today, and what you do is you put the whole world on that. But the deal is China is free to grow while every Western country is sustainable and inclusive, and that means infighting, and is diminishing, so that when China gets strong enough to claim global hegemony, every other country is too weak to fight back. And we all find ourselves under the thumb of the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese global hegemony for a century, living under social credit system programs to make sure we stay down and they stay up. So every Western country becomes a third world country and China becomes the world leader, whether you like it or not. That's where this ends.
Wow. I can't move to my next question without asking how successful do you think they are, and what can we do to stop them?
How's Germany doing today? How's Germany? I mean, the news today from Germany is that their word that starts with F. Yeah. So I'm being polite because I know there are children, even though they're too little to hear the word and know what it means. So Germany's in trouble. Europe is collapsing. America's fighting like hell. Canada's lost. We have a Canadian here who knows. He says, I'm from a communist country called Canada when he stands up on stage. If this was his opportunity, he'd say that. Australia's lost. New Zealand's hanging on by its fingernails. I've spoken there twice this year. Western countries are killing themselves with climate change ideology and with this inclusive ideology that's coming down, the woke stuff. But that's your E and your S in the ESG program. So they're extremely successful. Now, the other part of the program depends on Chinese success, which they've got their own problems that shouldn't be ignored, but they're also very, very successfully arranging things around the world so that they are cornering the world into their power. And a lot of what's happening even in Gaza has a lot to do with that. And when you understand that they have to create these trade routes and to maintain these trade routes so that they can get basically 5.7 billion people on their economic program and let the West die on the vine while we fight about whether we should have another windmill that doesn't work. You can say that it's going rather successfully. And this we come back. Why do they have to stop Trump? Why do they have to pull out all the stops? Why do we have this huge propaganda campaign of anti-Semitism in the right wing in America today? Is because Trump right now and his successors, if they pick up his torch, will threaten and destroy this attempted takeover of the world. But right now it's been going very successfully. Trump's the stand.
Well, we're still here, James. So,
well, yes, of course. Israel is actually literally on the front line of many of these battles, and the relationship between Israel and the United States and how strategic that is given your location in the world and your standing in technology and other things, and of course the size and might and economic power of the United States. This is the very fragile thing. This is the cord that if they sever, we're in a very, very bad situation.
That was actually not a joke, because the war Israel is conducting in the Middle East was an attempt that Trump seized in order to reconstruct the original American system of alliances, which is able to push Iran and its Russian and Chinese backers out of their influence in the Middle East. So we can't paint the whole picture here, but these are extremely important remarks. I'll end with one, zoom back into theory and Israel, and then we'll open it up for question. And that is, in the immediate aftermath of the unbelievably barbaric sexual crimes of October 7th, the whole feminist contingent in the United States, in academia, in politics, and on the international scene suddenly thought that Judith Butler said this was armed resistance. And suddenly they thought, well, we need more evidence. Well, we're not sure what happened. We're not sure if these were sexual crimes. And Israeli feminists who are woke here were completely shocked that their sisters abroad have completely turned their backs on raped Jewish women because they sided with the rapists. How did we get there?
We got there because there's a famous line that actually comes from David Horowitz, who had been radical within the Students' Democratic Society or something like this, Communist
SDS.
Front the Communist Front organization. He had been part of this. Then he comes out, he becomes a conservative, and he says that the mentality is that the issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. Okay, so just like with this woke right stuff in the U.S., the issue is not Israel. The issue is continuing the revolution, and this just happens to be the tool that they've picked up at the moment. Not that they're likely to put it down. Once you kind of go into the anti-Semitism, you kind of lose your marbles and don't come back. But what's happened is the issue is never the issue is always the revolution, has been the mentality of the Western left for decades. Okay, so Israel is recognized by these people, quite wrongly obviously, as a settler colonialist project. And so these poor Hamas just don't know better.
The indigenous people.
Yeah, that's right.
Color.
This is their land and you're stealing their land, and they, just don't know better. That's on the one side with the kind of, airy-fairy kind, because, they have different values. The postmodernism says, that there's a truth regime in the West, which they believe is illegitimate, but there's a different truth regime under, say, radical Islam, which is, perfectly valid within their own context, and we have no place to judge it, and this is part of it. But also, I think, and this is the more relevant part, and I think this ties to the question of the radical feminists as well, there is this influence of the guy I mentioned earlier, Frantz Fanon, that sees the post-colonial or decolonial project as inherently rooted in violence. This is where you get Judith Butler coming out and saying what she said about this being armed resistance, that this is just a form of armed resistance. It's doing what's necessary for them to regain their territory, to regain their standing in their own minds, which of course aligns perfectly with how they think about the situation themselves, probably because half of these people, Angela Davis, for example, was trained in Palestine. These ideas from the PLO and the PFLP were brought to the United States in these regards. And the feminists in the U.S. and in Canada and in the West have largely imbibed on this through the intersectional program and believe that the evil of Western civilization itself, or maybe we should just be more clear and say the evil of civilization itself is nothing in comparison to the harms that it has perpetrated elsewhere in the world. So there's this hierarchy or structure of prioritization that's now been inverted, because what has to happen more than anything else is for countries like Israel and the United States to be defeated. The logic is that, well, if Israel just stopped defending itself, it wouldn't be here to defend it. It wouldn't be here to cause a problem, and they would stop fighting. You would have peace if all the Israelis just, got in the sea, I guess, or worse. So it's your fault in their view, right? This is the twisted logic. But on the other hand, it's also the logic of the moment. It's Gaza Floyd. And the next thing that happens in the world will make this boring by comparison, and they'll move on, and they'll set down their rainbow flag to pick up the Palestinian flag, and they'll set down the Palestinian flag to pick up whatever the next flag is, and they'll set that flag down to pick up whatever the next flag is, and they'll all be out doing exactly the same protests in the exact same fashion, saying the exact same stupid and horrible things, on the wrong side of every single issue, because the point is just to continue the revolution against civilization itself.
Well, isn't that a familiar diagnosis of something we all know? Let's open the floor now to questions from you guys, and traditionally I always give Susie the first question.
The propaganda that they are running, this woke right propaganda, do you think that it is intended to give the impression of a real significant position specifically for an audience within the administration?
Yes. Yes. I think there are a few major targets of the woke right propaganda push. One of those targets is the movement itself, to make it toxic to people who are not particularly strongly MAGA. They don't identify that way, but they came along maybe for the first time in 2024. But also to cause this split between the pro-Israel and the, I'll say, less sure about Israel factions, that they bill themselves as anti-war or whatever. But the other audience that they're particularly targeting is the entities they've embedded within the administration, specifically to create a mandate within the administration to make the wrong kinds of decisions about this absolutely key geopolitical circumstance. And so if you don't understand what's happened, this is why I decided to speak up and put my career on the rock and just see what happens if it gets sacrificed or not. As soon as Trump took office, there was already people that were very eager to get radicals into as many positions as possible and to fill as many of those appointments as they could, knowing that they could take advantage of Trump's ignorance of their radicalism. They call this, and the slang for this that they use is hiding your power level, which means hiding how anti-Semitic, how racist, how sexist, or gay-hating that you are, to avoid words that end in phobia, because those are fake words in this context. The goal was to get these people in the position and then to create a mandate that looks like a populist uprising. This is a scissor type move, that you get some people in a position of power, but a small number, and then you create this, what looks like a popular uprising that gives them a mandate to act in order to answer the problem that the populist uprising is screaming about. I don't know if that made sense to you, but you get basically two people in office, you cause a protest, the two people in office pass a law to answer whatever the protesters want. That logic is the logic of a minority radical coalition across the board, everywhere, always, and that playbook is being played out by the woke right, certainly. And there are more of these people, unfortunately. Again, largely, who are they? Well, most of them are under 30 or 35 years old, male, and spend way too much time online. And the goal is to create the power for them, the conditions for them to be able to suggest more radical solutions, to dissuade Trump from making pro-Israel decisions, and so on. That's certainly part of the power play.
Hello. We've seen how the Western powers, who about 80 to 50 years ago were able to stand up, fight, and successfully defeat both Nazism and communism, basically crumbling before waves of immigration and leftist and also Nazi mind control, as you mentioned and provided in this talk. I was curious, what is your diagnosis for why they're so successful in manipulating people nowadays? Is it because of lack of religion, splintering of culture? Is it social media echo chambers? I'm curious to hear what your thoughts on the matter.
Well, social media is very important to this phenomenon, but I'll just say, for a propaganda campaign like this, that's a radical departure. So there's different kinds of propaganda campaigns. If you just want to take some people who are going along and get them a little to the side, you can use kind of very direct propaganda. You don't need a whole lot. But if you want to take people and have a radical departure from their existing views, so you take a mass of people who are generally pro-Israel and make them anti-Israel, and you want to do that in a short period of time, you need two things. You need the propaganda itself. Propaganda comes from the Latin propagare, which means to throw out. So propagate seeds, for example, like in the field. But you also need the soil that the seeds will land in to be fertile, to grow the sprouts of those seeds, and that they might grow into trees that bear fruit in the political warfare sense of the metaphor. So the most important thing leading to this is that the soil has been well prepared in the target audience. Young men have been badgered and beaten down and told that they're worthless and that they're useless and that they're the problem and that their conceptual penis has caused climate change for decades. They've been medicated in our schools for being boys. Oh, yeah, you want to go run around and climb these things. You must have attention deficit disorder. Here's a stimulant to fix your brain because obviously there's something wrong with a little boy who wants to climb a tree, right? And so they've been beaten down. They've been systematically deprived of opportunities. Everybody knows now in the United States that it's harder to get the same job as a white male because of the diversity, equity, and inclusion and DEI initiatives. And then on top of this, COVID comes along and we discover that everybody we thought we could trust, from the government to public health institutions to the media to the president of the United States, etc., is lying to us. In fact, Joe Biden stood on stage and said this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated, it's going to be a long winter of disease and death, and literally did the same kinds of techniques that Mao Zedong used to split the population and weaponize it against an enemy group. They've had enough of this. They're extremely frustrated. They don't know how to tell what's true, and they know that they've been lied to about a lot. This makes them very susceptible. They have a huge reservoir of emotion that can be exploited. They have a huge desire for change, even by radical means, because their lives are not as they wish they were. They're harder than they should be for unfair and unjust reasons that aren't even recognized. They've been censored. But most of all, they've been lied to so much that all you have to do is tell them that the other things you also believe were also lies. So, you thought you could trust the T.H. Chan School of, isn't that a funny name, right? That's owned by Ronnie Chan, or bought by Ronnie Chan. That's Chinese, and that's totally normal that the Chinese own the most prestigious school of public health in the United States, and that our 3 last CDC directors came from a Chinese-bought public health school at Harvard. I digress. But that our public health institutions, we're supposed to be able to believe those, and they told you all these things, and they said you have to wear this mask or you're going to kill your grandmother, and you can't have Thanksgiving dinner, and by the way, it's all your fault that other people are getting sick. And then all of a sudden, all you have to do, you have this other belief, conservatives support Israel. And all you have to do is say, what if that's also a lie? What if they want you to support Israel because they are profiting off of it at your expense? And you have these angry, disaffected young men who have absolutely legitimate grievances and a huge emotional reservoir and not enough other real problems in life, like a neighbor that's shooting at them all the time, that focuses your mind a little more clearly. And you just tell them everything you've learned is a lie. And the seeds of that propaganda work. So you start off small. You say, maybe the story that we heard about October 7th isn't completely true. Maybe it was an inside job, and they've all been groomed off of this idea of 9/11 being an inside job, so they think, well, that's plausible. And then you start telling them, what about this USS Liberty? Israel's not really a great ally. They shot one of our warships. And they tell the story, obviously, in a biased way. What if it was, in fact? Look how the point of World War II was to stop the Nazis, but we let Stalin go. We, in fact, allied with Stalin, and now everything's communist. Maybe that was an intentional plan. Maybe Churchill and FDR were actually supporting a communist takeover. And you just suggest and suggest and suggest and suggest, and you just keep tying it to these various frustrations. You've been lied to. You can't buy a home. Everything's expensive. The administration, the media, they all hate you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, until these people finally take, as they call it, the J pill or whatever else, the black pill too. They take in, maybe that's actually what's happening. And so the key to the propaganda, though, is that you have to have the fertile soil for the seeds to fall in, and then you just pick which seeds you're going to throw to agitate off of the mentality that the people have that's underlying it. So the condition primarily, though, is that everybody's been lied to, and these young men in particular have been systematically abused, at least psychologically and structurally in society, for their entire lives. And now you just have, you know, some heroes who come along and say, enough is enough, we're not going to do it anymore, and they follow those guys.
Let's take 2 more questions because James has a flight to catch, and we'll take them together and you can answer them together. Take the microphone to the back, and there's this girl with her hair up. And then someone from there.
Hi, James. Thanks for coming. First of all, I was very touched by a lot of your comments at the beginning. And my question is about the role of X. After Elon purchased X, people who were a fan of free speech were obviously excited by the possibilities that could bring. But what is your diagnosis right now? On the whole, it's been positive or negative for the U.S., globally, like the discourse that has developed in this, you know, new free speech opportunity we have, and how you see it in the future.
One more question on the other side.
Should I? Okay.
Hi, James. Thank you so much. So around a week after October 7th, you could see the Israeli flag above the Eiffel Tower or the Brandenburg Gate, and we were the oppressed for around a week. And after we started achieving a decisive victory, at least at first, we began to be the oppressor all of a sudden once again. So I wanted to ask you, what's your advice for Israel to get the decisive victory against evil and not be viewed as the oppressor or as the bad guy? To be strong and respected.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so 2 questions, very different questions. X is not an easy question to answer because it undoubtedly has broken the censorship industrial complex. It has allowed for us to find out things that we would not otherwise find out. And so we have to recognize that it being a free speech platform, as far as that goes, has changed the world. I mean, I don't think that Donald Trump is likely to have been reelected otherwise. I don't think we would know many of the things that we do know that are true, the Hunter Biden laptop story being one key example, actually, without having had at least one place where the truth can be told. The problem is, you know, you've probably heard that there's 0, 1, and 2 are all magic numbers. 0, if you have 0 free speech platforms, then you're caught in a censorship regime and you have very few options. Well, you have 1, that's a very special number. When you have 1 free speech place, now the truth can come out and it changes everything. But the problem is when you only have 1, you have no competition whatsoever. So 2 becomes a much more important and special number because now there's a competitor, so that if, say, your social media platform that allows free speech starts actually, you know, resembling a sewer, as X has, you have an alternative. So we're stuck in this situation with only this one outlet. And I don't know whether Elon Musk counts as a good guy or a bad guy in this whole story. I believe he's a complicated figure, to say the least. But I do know that X, if we give Elon Musk the most charity that he deserves in the he could possibly have, actually, that he's painted himself into a corner with this commitment to free speech that he can't seem to get out of. It turns out the enemy has sophisticated AI tools. It doesn't matter how X tweaks the algorithm so long as they're committed to anybody being able to post anything. His idea of freedom of speech but not freedom of reach doesn't work. The sophisticated AI tools allow the enemy to figure out the algorithm changes as fast as they're made. So if X says, you know, we're going to put the Nazis down and they can post it but nobody will see it, they can figure out how the algorithm works to get themselves back on top, usually within 36 hours. So this is a problem that the X engineers cannot keep up with. But the only way out of this problem is to then ban certain speech and no longer be a free speech platform. I will tell you that the day that Elon Musk said that he was going to buy Twitter, the day he said he was going to buy it, I immediately said, this is what's going to happen. X is going to be filled with racism, with Nazism, with fascism, with all of this, you know, awful speech about individuals and groups. I want to not use stupid phrases like hate speech. It's going to be filled with all of this nastiness. It's not clear who will be using it. My thought was that the left would pose as the right, or I didn't realize that basically every foreign country would also pose as the American right, and will fill this place with this nasty stuff. My thought at the time was to justify recensoring the platform, but that's one possible option. And the other possible option is to use it to spread these awful narratives. So at this point, I hate using X. It's this kind of necessary evil. I wish there was a competitor. I think that would start to clean the program up. I wish that there were steps to take to where we see hostile foreign action by bot farms and by coordinated groups, you know, military groups even, information warfare groups, on social media attacking other countries as a national security threat or as actually an attack, a military-style attack against our country, and figure out how to deal with these things. I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibility, for example, that X make it visible when somebody's posting from Pakistan, just as one example. I think that the platform, though, has become so overwhelmingly toxic that it's quite dangerous. But this was coordinated. I mean, the people that run Gab, Andrew Torba, for example, that runs Gab, certainly planned to come take over X. He runs his own social media platform, but he spends more time on X than he does on his own platform that he presumably makes money from. Why is that? Because he knows it's a fertile opportunity, and he's been bringing up an army of these weirdos and bot farms to bring over to X to cause this propaganda. That's intentional. This was an intentional move to poison and ruin this platform. Okay, so I don't like the platform now. I see it's a necessary evil. I think we must use it and to bring as much light and good in as we can. But I don't think it can be used reliably as a social media platform anymore because you can't be very social on there. Certainly everything I post, everything Chris has posted since we've been here has been attacked by hundreds, if not thousands of replies that are all like, oh, you're in Israel, why don't you stay there? Because, I mean, that wouldn't be that bad, actually. I noticed. But I do love my country. I mean, I've got American flags in my jacket, right? I do love my country, too. I would like to go to my home, too, and I would like to clean it up. But the thing is...
But if you miss your flight, I have a sofa in my living room.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm taller than you, though, a lot. Is it big enough?
The sofa is taller
Oh,
than
I got you. Okay. Just had to check. So anyway, I think it's a mixed bag. I think it's a huge problem, and I think that they need to do something more serious with it. Now, what about Israel? So first of all, don't worry about being seen as the oppressor. You have to do what you have to do. You tell the truth. You stand firmly. You're proud of what you're doing because you're doing the right thing. You're doing it in strength. And who cares if you were oppressed for... Who wants to be oppressed? Oh, the Eiffel Tower flew our flag because we're victims. Like, nobody wants to be victims. And that's not what I've seen here since I've been in this country. I've seen a proud people who's ready to do what needs to be done to solve the problem. And I think that, you know, I'm not as dire as Charlie Kirk was in saying that you're losing the PR war or any of this. The forces of PR are targeting Americans in particular, and you've got, frankly, somewhat bigger problems. So, what I would say is that if you keep projecting honesty and strength, you keep telling the stories. What I do agree with Charlie that if I saw more, if more Americans saw on social media from everyday Israelis stories of what it's like to be here, just seeing how proud you are, what you're accomplishing, why you're doing it, how normal life is. It's shocking that you're just out of, you know, there's a war like right there, and everybody's just going about life. These are inspiring stories. The masculinity, the healthy, fatherly masculinity where, you know, not only are you the loving father who's philosophically deep and saying interesting things and theological and religious, but also you're like, oh, I have to pick up my M4 and go to the border. Okay, let's go. That message is what every American young man aspires to be, and they are not getting that message. So if you don't have to project strength, you just have to show the strength that you are, and don't be afraid or ashamed to do it. Put this stuff out on social media. Don't hide don't hide yourselves from the world, because the light that you're shining is the light of civilization. And the more of us that see it, the more. So a lot of my friends that are fighting against this woke right in America, we would die to have these examples. We would love these examples. They help us make the case against tidal waves of some lady in Gaza holding a baby and using a filter to pretend that they're hurt when they're not even hurt. These are the things that just keep coming up. So it would be just wonderful to just see the stories of Israel being told honestly and clearly, just showing life as it is and explaining who you are and what you do and why you do it. Not because you want to be, oh, please like us, but just because you're proud of who you are and you're people to be proud of. So share that with us.
Absolutely. I think one important word here is defiance. That we are going to keep fighting this war in the face of your criticism. That we are not going to back down in front of moral grandstanding. James, this has been an amazing evening, an education, and also an opportunity to show our appreciation for your brave stand. So you're welcome here whenever you come, including on my sofa. Thank you all. Well, look at this. Standing ovation. Thank you very much for being with us this evening, and I'll see you on the next episode of Gatekeeper.